Bournemouth University, in my experience, seems to be an institution that really gets eating disorders, and that they aren't just the very simple case of people not eating enough and starving themselves. They really understand that there's issues underlying it. And also because of my own experience as a student, which frankly was a bit of a nightmare. I had 4 years as an undergraduate, and university life played a massive part in my story. I was diagnosed for the first time within 6 weeks of starting my history course at the University of Leicester in 1998. I just nipped through that. And the very worst, or one of the very worst moments, when the eating disorder had really taken over, had basically taken all the hope out of me, came whilst I was here at Bournemouth University starting a mental health nursing course. And unfortunately, because of the eating disorder, I didn't manage to finish the first year. So it's become very important to me to grab any opportunity that I can to help the university and to spread this message. I'm not an eating disorder expert. I can't talk to you about bulimia or bigorexia or disordered eating. And even within the context of anorexia nervosa, I can only really talk with any authority about my own condition, because one of the principal challenges with eating disorders is that each and every individual has their own difficulties, their own stories. Each eating disorder has its own origin and characteristics, and therefore the treatment that each person gets has to be specific to that individual if it's going to be successful. As part of my recovery from anorexia, I'm quite selective in how I engage with the wider eating disorder community, and I'm aware of which people and which discussions are going to be helpful to me and which aren't. When I look at how these are covered these days, it strikes me that although there's a lot of good work being done, there's loads of eating disorder documentaries on, even Louis Theroux's getting involved, and a lot of work is being done to tackle the misconceptions, there are still newspaper articles with pictures of weighing scales, and when I'm interviewed, I'm still getting journalists asking for me for photos of when I was really ill, because that somehow will show how much I've recovered. Unfortunately, most people's eating disorder experience will be reading an article, watching a documentary, even just seeing one of those pictures. And the danger, if that is the image that sticks in the minds of most people, is that they will continue to miss the signs, and the signs within themselves and in those close to them. And that, like me, the first time that the thought of eating disorders will even occur to them will be when they're sat in a doctor's surgery being diagnosed. I've entitled the talk Anorexia Nervosa, the Reality and the Recovery, because I wanted to challenge some of the misconceptions that still persist around eating disorders. And to aid this, I went to the National Eating Disorders Association website, which is the American Eating Disorders Association, because they had a page of statements which apparently are myths that still persist about eating disorders. And I thought that might be quite a good way of starting a discussion about some of them. A lot of them are completely preposterous. But each of them does contain a little element of truth and can be drawn out. And I'll try and use my own experiences to maybe develop them and see where the myth has come from, even though it's, basically wrong. Makes sense. While I'm going through this, I'll be talking about various events in my life. I'll be going back in time and forth and everything. So, just as a sort of outline of it, I was 14 when I decided that I had to change what I was doing and that I had to lose some weight. And then it was another 4 years before I was actually diagnosed. And I've had 2 inpatient admissions at Kinbridge Court Eating Disorders Unit, which is at St Anne's Hospital in Poole. First one was 25, then one was 29. And it was only then, around about the age of 30, which is 12 years after I was diagnosed, that I really began to take the steps towards recovery. And then I published a book, which is okay. And now I'm 38, so I'm 8 years into my recovery, which is still ongoing as we speak. So this is the first of the myths that I saw on the website. I have a son. I don't have to worry about eating disorders because they're a girl thing. And I thought I'd start with this one because it's relevant to myself. Now, I'm sure there's no one here today that still subscribes to the concept of eating disorders as being only a female issue. But if you do need convincing, let me assure you that eating disorders do not discriminate in any way, whether you're black or white, young female, or a 30-year-old man who's trying to remember what life was like before an eating disorder. Male patients accounted for 8.3% of hospital admissions in 2015-2016. And Beat estimate that up to a quarter of all cases are male, although the complexities and the secrecies that surround these illnesses do make it very difficult to provide definitive answers. And whilst eating disorders continue to be portrayed as a largely female issue, and I'm afraid that is generally the case, that Louis Theroux documentary had 5 seconds of a male patient in it in the whole hour, it's surely still going to be hard for men to accept the truth of their own conditions and to seek help. However, I think things in some ways are beginning to improve. There's a Guardian article which I purloined from July 2017, which highlighted a 70% increase in men being admitted between 2010 and 2016. Now, I've been contacted before about stories like this, about the number of men being admitted to hospital being on the increase, and as I always try to put across, the staple reasons that are put forward for causing eating disorders amongst females and are equally applicable to men. You've got societal pressures to conform to a physical ideal. You've got life pressures for which the sense of control that an eating disorder can give you can seem the ideal solution. For every picture of a size 0 model, you've got a picture of Joe Wicks with his top off. And we're so bombarded with messages and images about healthy eating and exercise regimes that it takes a pretty strong and, in my experience, fairly unique person to shut everything out and remain absolutely happy with how they look. Now, my anorexia took hold about 20 years ago when there was no social media and the internet was fairly still in its infancy. And the roots of my anorexia lay more in the response to the bullying that I was subjected to for being overweight than in any desire to pursue a physical ideal. But such images were much easier to avoid back then. In today's digital society, I'm not surprised at all that more and more men may be struggling to cope with an ever-increasing pressure to be fitter and to look better and to demonstrate to the world that they look good. And as I did in the article, it's surely no coincidence that there's been a 25% increase in steroid use amongst young men as well. But from a more positive standpoint, as I have also tried to put across, maybe the increase in male hospital admissions is due to increased awareness, i.e. that men would previously have gone undiagnosed due to ignorance or shame, are beginning to get the confidence to seek help. There's charities like Beat and Men Get Eating Disorders Too, who are working to raise awareness of eating disorders in men. So perhaps those men and those around them are starting to ask the question. Now, if I look through the prism of my own time in hospital, when across the 7 months I shared time with about 30 other patients, only one of them was a man. So I cannot and I would not look to argue against the point that eating disorders do still affect more women than men. But even so, I'm fortunate. The concept of female eating disorders eating disorders being a female issue has not really been part of my story. I was diagnosed first time straight off. There was no quibbling about just because I was a man it couldn't possibly have an eating disorder. And I don't feel as if my gender has had any effect on the treatment I received. And I do see great work being done to raise the profile. But I think as a general point, unfortunately, unless society begins to fight against the relentless pursuit of perfection, then these figures amongst men and women are just going to keep going up. So, on to the next one. Another bugbear of mine. Eating disorders are a choice. Now, on the surface, the sufferer can appear complicit in the damage that is being done to their body. And I can assure you that I've met many sufferers on my journey with this illness. I've shared any number of meal times and group therapy sessions and had private conversations, and I can categorically say I've never met anyone that wouldn't have wished their illness away if they thought they could have done anything about it. Even when I was lower than low, even more desperate and without hope, when I was alone in my rituals and just constantly doing what my eating disorder was trying to get me to do, I wasn't choosing anorexia. I never, ever considered the possibility that I had any choice in the matter. Now, to anyone with a healthy attitude to their body and weight and themselves, clearly there's a choice. Why wasn't I eating? Why was I going for another walk? Why was I doing it to my family? The truth was that I was so physically and mentally compromised that even though I felt guilt for submitting to the illness, I didn't possess anywhere near enough strength to actually fight it. And there was never a moment when I didn't wish that things could be different. And if I could have waved that magic wand, I would have done that in an instant. But when the illness is on your shoulder 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, constantly seeking to guide the way that you behave and the way you speak and the way you think, and when you do not believe that things are going to change, no matter how desperately you want them to, then not fighting back just seems like the easiest thing to do. And when you don't believe something will happen, no matter how much you wish it to, then why fight the inevitable? As I say, I'd love to be 6 inches taller and 10 years younger, but it's not going to happen. So, why bother? And that's how it felt with anorexia. I hated it and I wanted it to change, but it wasn't going to change. So I was stuck in that circle. Now I started to lose weight because it seemed to be the only way that I could stop the bullying that I was receiving for being overweight. And I lost the weight and the bullying stopped and I was really happy. It was just the best thing ever. But that was the only deal that I ever signed up to. I never wanted to be so thin that I was admitted to hospital. I never wanted 10 years of therapy and sore feet from all the walking, and osteoporosis because my diet was so poor. Now, I never wanted to stay in every night at university, and I never wanted to turn down every invitation because I needed to stay in and exercise, and well, alcohol's just empty calories, isn't it? So, that's pointless. I did all these things because I didn't have a choice about my anorexia, and when you see no way that anorexia will leave you alone, you try to cling on to those tiny moments that when you do everything, when you do all the exercise and you eat the thing, you get that moment of peace that going for a walk or turning down an invite gives you. That's all you can cling on to in the end. And in much the same way as eating disorders aren't a choice, I'm not sure I would describe my recovery as being a choice. In that I think I just happened to reach a stage where I summoned enough strength to ask for help. And that moment may have passed the next week or the next day or the next hour. And although that choice was mine, I do think it was it was partly a matter of timing, of the work of the medical practitioners, of the support of friends, and the emergence of a greater belief in myself, which was still mostly in defiance of what my brain was telling me. Now, I've chosen to keep fighting and to stay healthy and to embrace life away from the eating disorder. But that choice has only been available since I was given the opportunity at the eating disorder unit to live life as myself rather than the anorexic version of myself that I was throughout my 20s. And that's not a choice that I would have or could have made when I was at my illest. Next one. Parents have to take some of the blame. And again, I can only talk about my own case. And in my own particular situation, I can't subscribe to this at all. Now, there were moments when I blamed my parents, and when they were the first in line to get any flack that was flying, because I just kept thinking of how differently my life had turned out from how I wanted it and how they had wanted it for me. And there were many moments, without a shadow of a doubt, when they were the enemy. They were constantly on at me to eat more, and to get help and to just put on a pound of weight because it would make us so happy. When all I wanted to do was to just push them away and stop them interfering, and when I would always tell them that I was fine when we all knew that that wasn't the case. And it's only now, since I've begun this journey towards recovery, that I've been able to reflect and accept why it was that they never left me alone. Because far from taking the blame for my anorexia, they are the ones, possibly the only ones, that didn't accept what I had become to regard as the self-evident truth, that the eating disorder had won. I'm sure there were many times when they feared that I was giving up. Indeed, I sat them down about 6 months before my second admission, I think it was, and I just said, look, I'm done. I've tried fighting this for so many years and it's got me nowhere and it just makes me miserable, so I'm just going to give up. I'm not going to bother fighting. Don't ever think I'm going to seek help, because it's just not going to happen. I'm just going to live life and keep it going. And even then, thankfully, they still didn't give up on me. And I do believe that did play an important role in me eventually deciding to seek help, even if I still didn't really believe that there was any point in it. But as I say, I mean, my story is unique to myself, and I've heard many stories of less helpful parenting and from other sufferers. And I'm not saying my parents didn't make mistakes, but they're far outweighed by the ones that I've made. And I know without their love and support, I wouldn't be stood here now, not a chance. I don't know if it would have been different. I mean, my anorexia was diagnosed once I'd left for university. So the amount of time that my parents shared with me and my eating disorder under the same roof was actually quite limited. Had I been diagnosed when I was at school, then, there might have been slightly more conflict, perhaps. But when I look at those few moments of light and clarity, those times when the noise was just quietened down for a second, it was always my parents' support that shined out. So they certainly take a long way behind the bullying and the low self-esteem and the demands of society as to why anorexia came into our lives. Next one. These two I've jumbled together because they're kind of two sides of the same coin. If someone isn't displaying eating disorders behaviours, there's no need to worry. And as long as someone isn't emaciated, they are not that sick. Now, one of the elements that make eating disorders so difficult to challenge is the secrecy that surrounds them. The ability of the sufferer to indulge their illness to an extent far beyond that, which may be obvious to those around them. Now, I very rarely restricted my eating in front of my parents, at least in the early stages, but it was a very different story when I got to school, when I had control. Now, my parents knew I was going for a cycle ride. What they didn't know about was the massive long detour that I took to get round on the way home. And I'm not going to detail all the extreme behaviours that I indulged in because, I mean, that would take 2 hours. But suffice to say that my worst, the illness permeated every second of my day and every activity that I undertook. It was everything was geared to allowing my anorexia to be happy. And of course, whatever happens in the everyday does not always reflect what's going on up here in your mind. I didn't really start displaying extremes of behaviour until I was 16, 17, 18. But the starting point of my eating disorder was that day as a 14-year-old when I decided to lose some weight. And in the subtle shift of discourse from bullying about my weight to a wave of praise and compliments about my new slimmer figure. And then even once the concerted exercise programs were underway and the calorie counting had begun, my parents were making sure that I was eating enough to maintain my weight. So the thoughts and beliefs that had been building and had been reinforced over that 4-year period when I was 14 weren't being challenged because no one knew there was a problem. And that meant that I got to Leicester University and had full control for the first time in my life. And it took me 6 weeks to end up in a doctor's surgery for that initial life-changing diagnosis. Now, I am one of the lucky ones. I went to that GP and she said straight away, eating disorder. There was no prevarication or suggestion that all I had to do was eat a bit more and I'd be okay. Now, maybe I was lucky because I went to a university GP, so eating disorders are more of an issue. If I'd gone to a local GP with a massive case book, then things might have been different. I didn't have to go back to the GP 3 times. I didn't have to wait 11 weeks to be referred to specialist services, which is unfortunately the situation as highlighted by The Independent last year. Again, see, picture of weighing scales. Ridiculous. I'm sure you're aware of anecdotal evidence where sufferers have been refused treatment because they're not ill enough. Now, believe me, anorexia can still be in charge of your actions and your minds, even when you're a healthy weight and even when it doesn't seem so at the time. Restoring weight is actually the easy part, the necessary first step to battling the demons that you carry around with you 24 hours a day. Now, if intervention could come earlier and work to combat these demons in your heads could be given while the sufferer still has the physical capacity and the cognitive faculties to do so, then fewer patients might end up in inpatient treatment. If in that 4-year period someone had spotted something and I'd got something sorted, maybe it wouldn't have taken 12 years to start turning things around. But, who knows? What I do know is, of course, the massive weight loss was just the alarm that indicated that there was a fire. The fire, unfortunately, had that 4-year start. So, if the sufferer isn't ready to recover, there is nothing that can be done. And if the sufferer won't recover until they have discovered the cause of their eating disorder. Now, again, talking only for myself, quite a lot of that resonates with me. This is perhaps the least ridiculous of all the myths that have been put up there. But again, I'm very much aware that I don't possess the knowledge to say this is right for everyone, and I wouldn't project my own experiences out to anyone else. But having spent all that time on an eating disorders unit and seen other people and heard their stories, I've kind of become convinced that there's 3 main things that you need if you're going to start your path to recovery. Firstly, desire to get better. Secondly, help from outside, and that can come from anyone. That could be a friend, that could be someone down a phone line, that could be medical practitioners. And thirdly, and this only really works if you've got those two in place, is a belief within the sufferer that things can be different. As I said, I mean, I've had the other two almost constantly, but that third one is the difficult one to kick in. Now, as I say, I've met many people across my 20 years association with this illness, all at various stages in the battle. Some in denial about the extent of their illnesses, many of them brought so low that inpatient treatment, often under section, was the only choice, only option available to them. And every single one of those people, whatever the extent of their suffering or the stage of the recovery that we're at, wanted it to be different. They wanted to get better. And from the day I was diagnosed, from the day that anorexia came into the equation, I knew I didn't want it. I knew I wanted to change things. And that's not to say that throughout those 12 years I didn't recognise the advantages of being anorexic because I perceived them. Or indeed that as I became more and more engaged in the illness and recognised the classic symptoms in myself, that I didn't do everything I could to protect the illness from the people that were trying to help me and to relieve the grip it had on my life. But even then, I still clung to that hope that one day things would get better. As I say, I took the decision to lose the weight because the bullying had become so intense and so relentless that the only solution seemed to be that I had to change, to take away the aspect of myself that these people found so apparently repulsive. And then when the bullying changed to the compliments about my weight, that connection between looking good and feeling good became so entrenched that I became obsessed with keeping that good feeling. And it was never a race to the bottom. I didn't want to keep losing weight. I just wanted to stay where I was. But as I got further away from the misery of the bullying and the demon in my head that being overweight was, then that fear, that demon of being overweight became so much more powerful, to the extent that the only real goal of my entire existence was not to be fat. And that's where anorexia came in. That filled that void in my life, and it gave me all the tools to avoid the one thing that I'd come to fear above all others. So I put up with the cold and the tiredness and the pain because no one could call me fat. And I kept others away because they would take anorexia away, and anorexia was the one thing that was protecting me from being a blimp. And through all this, through all the years and the worry and the endless exercise, there wasn't a moment when I didn't wish things could be different. But I just couldn't conceive of how that would happen. And that lack of hope strengthened anorexia's grip on my life. And even though I always craved that magic wand, that vicious circle that I was in meant that every day was the same, and it just went round and round and round. But one thing I am convinced about is that anorexia cannot be beaten alone. The illness knows too much. It knows which buttons to press. It knows the points at which we give up the fight, which in my case was usually the 10 seconds it took me to get from bed to scales and first thing in the morning. Anorexia becomes so entwined in your mind that it takes on your own voice. Your instincts become anorexic ones. And it's with you every second of the day, influencing every decision to the extent that the person you were before the eating disorder just virtually disappears. And I believe, therefore, that if you're ever going to make an attempt at a recovery, you need someone to come in and interrupt that dialogue in your head. And that person could be different in each particular case. Now, I talked to family and friends, and I'd had many, many sessions of therapy and help groups, and nothing had made the breakthrough. I remember talking to a therapist about 2 months before my second admission, And the sole goal for my week was to sit down for 20 minutes and watch an episode of The Simpsons. And I couldn't do it. Because as soon as I got home, it was just back at my house and back in my life where I was alone with the anorexia. And in my case, it was only when I entered inpatient treatment, where I wasn't allowed to be alone with my anorexia and where the help to interrupt that dialogue was there all the time, that I was able to begin my recovery. And even then, I had to have 2 shies at it. And there were those in hospital that weren't ready, despite all the help, to begin to tackle their demons. And again, this is where recovery is such an indefinite science. So for me, this is where that third aspect of belief comes in. You can have the desire to change things and as much support and professional expertise on hand as you want. But if you don't believe in your own capacity to fight this illness and to continue fighting it when that support network has been taken away, then those first steps, those first days just seem insurmountable. Now, let me assure you, recovering from an eating disorder, especially one that had been the dominating influence in my life for 12 years, almost 15 years, was the hardest, most daunting challenge I've ever taken on. And it took me to some extremely dark places, and it forced me to confront all those fears and those assumptions that had become so huge. And I'd never have been able to start that recovery, which is still continuing to this day, without that belief that I had it in me to do it, wherever it was that belief come from. Because one of the other things that anorexia does is really erode your belief in yourself. And it took me reaching rock bottom to accept that my first hospital admission had been a failure, and to accept the humiliation of going back a second time, that I realised that maybe it was worth the risk of taking the chance, and that with the right support I could do it. And that belief wasn't there at the start of the second admission. It emerged over time, and only with the help of other patients and other staff, and with the passing of each little obstacle that I took on. And what was also crucial in that second admission, and in fortifying the belief that I had in myself, was the work that I did into the root causes of my eating disorder, what it was that anorexia had become the solution to. And I in one session, I thought back when I was in year 3 in primary school, and we did Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat, and I was a loaf of bread, and I was great. And everyone laughed, and it was brilliant, and I felt fantastic. And then 2 years later, we did Oliver, and I couldn't think of anything I'd like to do less than put myself on a stage and have people laugh at me. And then I thought, well, what changed? And then I remembered that when I was in year 4, my school teacher got me to write the names of anyone that talked while he was out of the classroom on the board, and they got held back at break time, which the rest of the people in the class didn't really like that much. And that was the first time that I remember the teasing and the name calling and the bullying, and from that moment, that happy-go-lucky kids just disappeared. And it's when you can pinpoint that type of thing that you recognise that this isn't all your fault, and you aren't that bad, and that you deserve better. And I know, you get angry. You get angry with that teacher, and you get angry with the anorexia for keeping that year 3 boy away. Now, on to our next statement, stroke myth. If my loved one insists that they're fine, there is no need for me to worry. Now again, this has got personal relevance. As I said, my anorexia wasn't diagnosed until I got to university. So other than 1 year when I was discovering myself after university, my parents and I have lived apart. So the majority of that time, the contact was over the phone. And the conversation would always come round to the question of my health, to which my answer was always, I'm fine, don't worry, I'm absolutely fine. And I knew I was lying, and I'm pretty sure they knew I was lying. But we went through the same routine, usually including a promise from me to really try hard. I promise I'll really try hard this time. But I couldn't get off the subject quick enough, and I'm pretty sure that I didn't do much to reduce the level of worry that they were experiencing back 100 miles away in South Wales. But what was motivating me at the time was this need to keep people away, to protect my anorexia from anyone that would come between us. I'd done everything I could. I'd moved away from home. I never told anyone at work about my illness because they might interfere. I never invited anyone to my house because, why would I want to do that and interrupt my routine? And saying I'm fine was just another part of that. And I wanted things to be different, but the chasm between that and the belief that there was really any chance that things could change was so huge that the risk involved in letting go of the illness involved was just not worth it. The risk involved in inviting my parents to stay over and therefore not being able to go for a walk that one night and therefore my weight might balloon. The prospect of seeking help again became a symbol of such personal humiliation that it was non-negotiable. There were people in that first admission that were on their 20th admission. And the thought that I'd been in there once and I'd kicked the illness made me feel fantastic. And as time went on and things started to go wrong and the other parts of my life span out of control again, that was my single last grasp of self-esteem, was that I'd been to an eating disorders unit once and I'd beaten this illness. And I knew, so again, whenever anyone said, "Oh, are you sure you don't want to go and see a doctor again?" No, I'm fine, absolutely fine. Even though I knew in my heart of hearts things were as bad as before. But because in my head I'd cracked it the one time, then I could do it myself. I didn't need any more help. I could do it again. And every day I'd wake up determined that, right, they're really concerned about you. I need to get some help. Let's do it today. And then I'd step on the scales and the familiar rush of relief and pride of not having put on any weight just took over again. And I did, somewhere in my head, think that by saying I was fine, it would stop my parents worrying, that it was better for them, for me not to say that I was struggling. Now I knew it was going to be hard for them. I mean, they were in South Wales, they were miles away, and I just convinced myself that if I kept saying I'm fine, at some point they'd believe me and stop worrying. And I just felt that if I was going to recover again, or if I was going to start to recover, then I had to do it for myself, and I did believe that one day it would happen. And even though I knew that, I didn't quite feel ready at the time, so saying I'm fine became a way to keep people away, a way to stop them worrying, a delaying tactic until that day when the magic wand would come out and everything would be fine. And of course it never worked. That magic wand never appeared. And thank God they did keep worrying, because without them I don't know I'd be here today. Yes. On to my next one. Another couple together, again, two sides of the same coin. the main eating disorder symptom I have to worry about in my loved one is weight loss. And eating disorder behaviours only focus on food. And again, this goes back to those newspaper articles with pictures of scales and pictures of thin people, And whenever I've been approached to speak about eating disorders, I've always had two main focuses. Firstly, to raise awareness about eating disorders in men. Secondly, to try and emphasise the point that eating disorders are so much more than just weight loss and food. Now, I don't deny that eating and weight are very important factors, and in the early stages of recovery, it really is all that you can and need to concentrate on. But low weight is just a symptom. Granted, it's the most damaging symptom and the most shocking symptom, but it is just a symptom of a very long-term, very deep mental illness. Now, I only experienced rapid weight loss when I went to university, and by which time the more invidious behaviours, the sharing out of food, the compulsive exercising, the calorie counting, the structuring my day around my eating disorder, had a good couple of years to embed themselves in my life. And the belief that personal happiness lay in what the scales were telling me and in what my friends were telling me about how I looked had been there for 4 years. And my sense that somehow I wasn't as good a person as my friends had been there since I was 9. So the physical aspect of it, the return to a healthy weight, is just the first vital step towards being able to address all the other issues that have led you into that hospital bed. Now, if you go to an eating disorders unit, there is an inordinate acute focus on food. The discussions about food, they're about the meals, about how the meals make us feel, about what we're scared of, about who's getting away with what at the table. And those first few weeks are really hard. And before I went into hospital, I was working full time. My days were structured so much that I could have told you what I was doing a month in advance on a particular day at a particular time. It was monotonous, but it gave me the sense of control and ensured that I could fit all my exercise around the meals, which at that point had to be 4 hours apart. I'm never quite sure why, but they did have to be 4 hours apart. So to go from that life to the one in hospital, where literally the only thing that you have as any kind of structure was the 3 meals a day, it's very difficult to focus on anything other than food. Especially when you're immediately confronted with the scary situations that you've been doing everything you can to avoid, and don't at that stage, because your weight is so low, possess the cognitive ability to process the thoughts that those situations engender. So that first month where all you're doing is putting on weight to get to a stage where you can start groups and take a more active part in the programme is incredibly tough, and not everyone gets past that point. It's too tough. For me, the boredom and lack of structure of those first months was just about my main motivation in keeping on with the programme and getting to a stage where I could do groups and actually add some variety to the day. Although I did soon come to realise that talking in a group about your eating disorder is really quite a scary thing. But the reason I think that I feel so strongly about this is that I'm living proof that getting to a healthy weight is really only the start of an effective recovery. And when I first went to hospital when I was 25, it was an incredibly uplifting experience. I really engaged with the programme. I had my first experience of spending time in a female environment, which wasn't as scary as I built it up to be. And as I went up the BMI scale to a healthy weight, I embraced all these new exciting opportunities and these new things that I was experiencing. And at that stage, the inpatient programme was more intensive. There was less opportunity for independent decision making and no opportunities for outpatient daycare. So once I gained the healthy weight and got discharged, I was thrust straight back into my solitary life, my same house, same job, same routine. But now I had this confidence that, hey, I've got a healthy body, so I can do whatever I want. I don't have to worry about, how much exercise I'm doing or anything. And I believed that I'd beaten anorexia. Now, what I'd done, of course, was to attain a healthy weight and not done anything significant to tackle those issues that were underpinning the eating disorder. And it wasn't very long until things started to go south again. So when I became an inpatient for the second time, in December 2009, I was pretty much a broken man. I was bereft of even that pride of having beaten an eating disorder on one admission. And I looked in the mirror and I thought, this is rock bottom. And that sense of it can't get any worse than this, I think was crucial in helping me turn it around. Because everything I'd believed, everything that I'd tried to satisfy the eating disorder so that I wouldn't have to go into hospital again and so that people would leave me alone and that I could just get on with life, had brought me right back there on that hospital bed. So the second time, I just said, right, let go. Just once, just close your eyes, take a risk, just take the chance that everything that I'd been told by the staff and by my family and by my friends was actually true. That there was a grey area between being very thin and being overweight. And I took the experience of the first admission and resolved to do everything differently. So this time, I didn't say that I was too scared to eat chips. I ate chips. I didn't take every opportunity to go for a walk when it was there. Some days I said, no, I'm not going to do it. Because that's the only way that those conceptions in my mind were ever going to be broken down. And I knew that it was my last chance because I couldn't do it without the support that was in that hospital. I'd proved that. I'd always wanted to change, but without that support, without someone interrupting that dialogue in your head, when you're confronting the biggest fears that you can possibly imagine, it's just impossible. And I've never been able to confront those fears in the real world. So again, while I'm never going to say that gaining a healthy weight is not important, it's crucial. And it's absolutely the necessity you need to start a recovery from anorexia. The low weight physical aspect of the illness is not the thing that really grinds you down. My anorexia wasn't about being thin or cold or sore or tired. It was about fear. It was full on 24-hour, never-ending fear of being fat. And my days became an endless routine of activity engineered to ensure that from the time I woke up to the time I went to bed, I hadn't put on any weight. And that was it. Everything else in life could go hang. That was the important thing. And it was exactly the same whether I was 8 stone or 7 stone or 6 stone. And it didn't matter how determinately I told myself every day that this time it's going to be different. This time I have to stop this spiral. That first extra crisp, that first half pound on the scales was always too difficult. So the lies and the secrecy had just become tools in a fight against fatness and the way that I would feed my eating disorder to protect me against the one thing that I feared above everything else. And the longer and longer I continued, even in the many years where I maintained a low weight without trying to lose any more, the greater the fear grew until I can't read my writing. I convinced myself that there was no prospect of recovery. The evidence of my childhood proved that I was fat, and the only alternative was to be thin, and there was no grey area in between. And if I risked eating anything extra, I would lose control and become the fat person that I was meant to be. Now, my anorexia didn't allow for treats, it didn't allow for a day off. Everything from family relationships to jobs to a social life had to be subordinated to the decrees of my eating disorder. And those moments of short-lived exhilaration when you got a good exam result or your football team scored a goal was very quickly replaced by that familiar mental urge to exercise or to weigh myself. And of course, if these statements were true, then once I'd achieved my goal, then I'd have been happy because, you know, it's all about being thin, isn't it? You know. But the real harm in anorexia is in the fact that it's a no-win deal. It's however much weight you lose, however much you shape your life around its demands, and however many things you push away, it's never enough. Anorexia does not stop. Once my daughter with anorexia gains weight, she will be fine. And of course, if it's all to do with food and weight, then all you have to do is reach BMI 20 and you're fine, aren't you? And after that first admission, that was me. I'd reached a healthy weight and I felt as if I'd completed the journey. It was done. I'd done all I had to do. And anorexia would never rule me again. And of course, I hadn't done enough, anywhere near enough, to stop the wheels coming off again. In those 2 hospital admissions in Cambridge Court, I found an environment where I could actually be myself, where I was given the time and the space to find out who the real person underneath the illness was. In the real world, I'd become entirely defined by my anorexia. It was the one thing that people noticed about me. On an eating disorders unit, it's the one thing we've all got in common. And as I progressed through the programme and my weight gradually increased, I was able to bring out all those hidden aspects of my character that I'd shied away, that I'd hidden away because people would laugh at me or they'd think it was ridiculous. And in that supportive environment, with all the positive feedback and the encouragement, I flourished. Away from there, it was much, much harder. Because when you have those close your eyes and take a chance moments, there isn't anyone else there to pick up the pieces if it goes wrong. And when you eat something challenging, it's your choice. And when you're out for a walk, it's your decision whether you take the long way or the short way around. And trying to make the right choices all the time can be exhausting. Almost as exhausting as complying with every tiny demand of an eating disorder. And I haven't made, and I don't make those right decisions all the time. And my life, and I'm pleased to say in some degree that it is a life rather than the existence that was my 20s, is still coloured by unhelpful thoughts and irrational concerns, and my day is still a routine to a certain degree. So where am I in my stage of recovery? I don't view myself as recovered, at least insofar as I haven't reached the point of which I thought recovery would be, where I wouldn't care. Yesterday, rather than having one medium and one large coffee, I had 2 large coffees, and it's been on my mind ever since. It's see, because anorexia had 12 good years in which to embed itself before I really started to fight back. And 12 years is a lot of really hard work to turn around. And maybe if that idea of a perfect, no caring recovery is what I'm aiming for, then I don't know, maybe I won't get there. But then if I look back at that younger man that lived with this illness throughout his 20s, there's no way he'd have seen me up here now. This would have been far too scary. There's so many of you. You wouldn't have had any interest at all in what I was saying. I'd have been way too gutless to even contemplate doing this. He wouldn't have thought there was any possibility of living at a healthy weight for 8 years, of not having stepped on the weighing scales in those 8 years, of not knowing to the calorie exactly what he was eating. And the idea of holding down the same job for 7 years without worrying that someone's going to find out about my illness and I'd have to move on, or of playing football again and actually winning something as part of a team would have been fantasy. And he couldn't have gone on television, he couldn't have spoken to the newspapers or taken the decision to get all those photos of when I was really ill and chop them up, because I realised that I was only holding on to them because someday might come when I needed to convince someone that I once had an eating disorder. And look how ill I was. And he'd never have had the confidence to go on a date or to fall in love and get married like I did last year. He could have never imagined that someone else another person could hold you and make you feel as secure and safe as anorexia once did. So, moving forward, do I have to accept that my recovery might not be perfect? That there might be a grey area between anorexic John and complete carefree attitude that I'd always dreamed of? Is there a danger that if I keep waiting for that perfect recovery, that life will start passing me by again and that I'll just construct another failure with which to beat myself up? I do sometimes think that doing these talks and going over my past again might be holding me back from moving on from the illness, because anorexia controlled my thoughts and my actions and took away so much of my true self that it was barely visible, and it still gnaws at the edges. But it doesn't define my life anymore, and every success or failure that I have is mine and mine alone, and it's credit to the help I've had from clinicians and family, and I've done a little bit myself, that this recovery has been way more of a success story than I could have hoped for, really. So hey, maybe ultimate success lies in recognising that I'm not perfect and that good enough is good enough. And that, unless anyone has any questions, is the end. Thank you very much. And there's a nice picture of me married.